On August 30th, 1923, the U.S. commissioned USS Colorado. Under the terms of the Washington Treaty and then the First London Treaty, no more battleships could be started until January 1st, 1937. That's not to say, though, that battleship design didn't continue. Many designs were bandied about in the 20 years between the designing of the Colorados and the start of the next class. All played with the three fundamentals of armament, speed, and protection. Some were fast, some were slow. Some were heavily armed, some were lightly armed. Some were heavily armored, some were lightly armored. Many stayed within the 35,000-ton limit, some not so much. The design that finally went into production, thus starting the fourth and final generation of American battleships, was unsurprisingly right at the upper limit of what was allowed to be built under the terms of the recently signed Second London Treaty, and technically very advanced. Notably, though, construction didn't start as soon as possible. Instead, the U.S. decided to wait 10 months and see what everyone else was going to do. Specifically, they waited to see if Japan would retroactively sign on by the April 1st, 1937 deadline. When Japan didn't, the escalator clause to allow upgunning was invoked. Similarly, since they were still under construction when war started, thus ending all treaties, additions could be made while building that put them over the now defunct 35,000-ton limit to become the 36,600-ton North Carolina class that was started in October of 1937. Main armament was originally to have been 12 14-inch 50 caliber guns, the largest diameter allowed by the treaty, in 3 quadruple turrets. It had long been known, or at least assumed, that Japan wouldn't sign on to the Second London Treaty, though, thus the delay in starting construction of the second ship and finishing the first. When they didn't, the escalator clause was invoked to raise diameter to 16 inches. This was no small matter. Alone, the U.S. had the industrial resources to simultaneously develop 2 major caliber guns and their mounts, fully intending to never use one of them. Propulsion reverted to direct drive geared turbines. There was interest in retaining turboelectric drive, but the 35,000-ton limit in place when design work started made this impractical. Speed was increased as a result of improved engine technology and hull design. This allowed these ships to be faster than previous battleships and thus more multi-function. As a result, while the older and slower battleships would spend the war providing fire support, the newer ones that could more or less keep up with them spent the majority of their time escorting the all-important carriers. Another notable change was the adoption of twin rudders instead of the one large one used on previous battleships. This not only improved handling, but also gave a level of redundancy. Protection was also revised, though still retaining the all-or-nothing pattern. Of note, their armor was meant to protect them against 14-inch shells, the most allowed by the treaty in force when work began. When Japan refused to sign the treaty, the default standard threat jumped to 16 inches. Unfortunately, to increase protection and remain within the 35,000-ton limit would have required a new design. This would have slowed production, so increased protection would have to wait until the next class. The hull design was very different. These were the first battleships to be longitudinally framed. The lack of casemates meant the deletion of the raised forecastle deck, leaving a bow-to-stern flush deck. To save weight, extensive welding was used. Portholes in the hull were omitted. The high tower superstructure negated the need for cage or tripod masts. The single rear main turret left plenty of room at the stern for 2 catapults to launch 3 scouting and observation float planes. The only real disappointment was a severe vibration aft at high speeds, which was mitigated but never totally cured by stiffening certain parts. North Carolina was started October 27, 1937, and finished April 9, 1941. Washington was started June 14, 1938, and completed May 15, 1941. Main armament was 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns in 3 triple 1,420-ton turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft, all on the center line. As with the previous 3 classes, the guns in each turret were individually sleeved, meaning they could raise, lower, shoot, and reload separately of each other. Again, as such, it would be proper to call them 3-gun turrets rather than triple turrets. Again, they used a downward swinging breech block. Maximum elevation was 45 degrees, giving them a range of 18.5 miles. Loading was done at 5 degrees, with the guns returning to that angle as they ran back out after recoiling 4 feet when fired. Rate of fire was up to 4 rounds per minute per gun, with a more realistic rate being 2 rounds per minute. Like many battleship guns in the 30s and 40s, to help increase barrel life, about 80% of the bore length was chrome-plated. 130 rounds were usually carried per gun. Unlike the older ships that were relegated to fire support, they usually carried 3/4 armor-piercing and 1/4 high-capacity rounds. Both types used 6 powder bags per shell. The high-capacity rounds were 1,900 pounds with a 153.5 pound bursting charge and a muzzle velocity of 2,635 feet per second. The armor-piercing rounds were a brand new, super heavy 2,700 pound shell with a 40.75 pound bursting charge and a muzzle velocity of 2,300 feet per second. Combined with radar fire control, RPC, and being the culmination of 30 years in planning a long-range battle, they were arguably the best armor-piercing shells at long range ever used on a battleship. Secondary armament was 20 of the now standard excellent 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun in 10 twin turrets, 5 midship on each side, with turrets 2 and 4 being at the main deck level and 1, 3, and 5 being 1 deck higher. Propulsion was by 8 boilers venting to a pair of funnels, which produced steam to 4 turbines. These provided 121,000 horsepower to the 4 shafts they directly drove through reduction gearing. This gave them a top speed of 27 knots, which was fast enough to escort the carriers most of the time. Again, turning radius was excellent with 2 rudders. Protection was improved. Not too surprising considering 20 years had elapsed since the design of the previous class, in addition to them being 4,000 tons heavier. Belt armor was 12.5 inches thick from turret 1 through turret 3. This thinned down to 6.5 inches underwater as it neared the bottom and merged with the TDS. Of note, the armor sloped outward 15 degrees from the bottom to the top, meaning incoming shells hit at an oblique rather than 90-degree angle when fired horizontally. This significantly increased the strength of the armor and made it equal to 16 inches hit at a right angle. From the top of the belt armor up to the main deck, side armor was 1 inch thick. Deck armor was made up of 3 layers. The main deck was 1.5 inch thick and meant to trigger any bombs or shells. The second deck, which was the main armored deck and formed the roof of the belt armor, was 5 inches thick, increasing to 5.5 inches over the magazines and machinery. The third deck was 3/4 inch thick, increasing to 2 inches over the magazines and intended to stop any splinters from piercing into the ship's vitals. Armored bulkheads 11 inches thick forward and 8 inches thick aft formed the ends of the armored box. Barbette armor was up to 16 inches thick. Turret armor was 16 inches on the front, 7 inches on the roof, and 9 inches on the sides. The conning tower was 16 inches on the sides and 7 inches on the roof. The engine room was divided into 4 compartments to contain flooding. These were lined up from bow to stern, with each compartment stretching from one side of the ship to the other. The idea was that if one of the rooms took on water, it would flood evenly across the width of the ship, preventing it from taking on a dangerous list and thus reducing the chances of capsizing. To facilitate subdivision, each compartment contained 2 boilers and 1 turbine, with each turbine directly driving its own propeller shaft. The TDS also ran from turret 1 to turret 3. Midship, this was 5 layers thick, consisting of an air-filled layer, another air-filled layer, a liquid-filled layer, usually fuel oil, another liquid-filled layer, another air-filled layer, and finally the holding wall. Near the ends of the TDS and outboard of the turrets, hydrodynamics forced the hull to narrow, so the TDS thinned to 4 layers by omitting the outermost empty space. As compensation, the holding wall was thickened. Deep skedges were fitted around the inner shafts, both to protect them and the rear magazine. Finally, the bottom of the ship was triple-hulled and honeycombed to help deal with the threat of mines or anything else that might explode under the ship. Being brand new and badly needed in service, neither ship could be spared for, or even needed, major modernization. Upgrades were limited to better search and fire control radar, along with improved light and medium anti-aircraft armament. As compensation, the boats were removed. Even still, by the end of the war, displacement had grown to well over 42,000 tons. Both were in the Atlantic on December 7, 1941, having recently entered service. North Carolina spent the first 6 months there escorting convoys. In mid-June of 1942, she transferred to the Pacific with the carrier Wasp. She escorted the carrier Enterprise first during the invasion of Guadalcanal and then during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. On September 15, 1942, while escorting the carriers Wasp and Hornet, she was one of 3 ships hit by a submarine torpedo spread. The hit was outboard of Turret 1 and blew an 18 by 32 foot hole that breached the reduced TDS. The second and third decks buckled and the magazine flooded. The damage was repaired by late November of that year. Upon returning, she spent the rest of the war escorting the carriers and occasionally providing fire support. Highlights included the Gilbert's invasion, the Marshall's invasion, the raid on New Ireland, the raids on Truk, the invasion of the Palaus, the liberation of the Marianas. She missed the Battle of Leyte Gulf due to yard work, the liberation of the northern Philippines, the invasion of Iwo Jima, and the invasion of Okinawa. Post-war, she was decommissioned to reserve, but preserved as a museum ship at Wilmington, North Carolina, where she remains to this day. You can call her at 910-251-5797 or look her up on the web. I've been there a couple times and can pretty much guarantee if you're still listening to this, you'll have a blast, if you haven't already. Washington spent the first 3 months of 1942 training along the East Coast. In March, along with other ships, she sailed across the Atlantic to join the British Home Fleet, the task force admiral on her being washed overboard along the way. This was done to free up British ships to take part in the invasion of Madagascar. Washington spent most of the summer escorting Russia-bound convoys, including the disastrous PQ-17, through the Norwegian Sea in case the German battleship Tirpitz set sail. In late August 1942, she finally transferred to the Pacific, just barely missing the Battle of Santa Cruz by dint of escorting a convoy, and took up the role of skirting the carrier Enterprise. On November 14th-15th, 1942, she took part in the overnight Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, where she almost single-handedly mortally wounded Kirishima and a destroyer while lightly damaging a heavy cruiser. Afterward, she spent the rest of the war escorting the carriers and occasionally providing fire support. These included the Solomons invasions, the Gilbert's invasion, the Marshall's invasion. Off Kwajalein on February 1, 1944, she collided with USS Indiana, crushing her bow. Returning from repairs at the start of June, she took part in the liberation of the Marianas, the invasion of the Palaus, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the liberation of the northern Philippines, the invasion of Iwo Jima, and the invasion of Okinawa. At the end of the war, she was undergoing refit. Post-war, she was decommissioned to reserve and finally sold for scrap in 1961.